Good morning. I would like to welcome everyone to the MD Anderson Cancer Center Enjoy Science seminar series. This is a series of lectures given by MD Anderson faculty members and organized by the Office of the Chief Scientific Officer, Dr. Jim Gray. I'm Alessandra Ferraioli and I have the pleasure of hosting this series with my colleague, Dr. George Kalin. The goal of the Enjoy the Science initiative is to strengthen connection between the scientific and medical community at MD Anderson and our colleagues, our patients, and our friends around the world during this time of limited in-person, at the bench, and in the clinic activities. Today's seminar is being recorded and will be made available on the Enjoy Science website later this week. The speaker of today is Dr. Cassian Yi. Dr. Yi is a professor in the departments of melanoma medical oncology and immunology. He is also the director of solid tumor cell therapy at the Center for Immunology Research at the MD Anderson Cancer. Dr. Yi does not really need introduction. He is a world-known expert in the fields of tumor immunology and adoptive therapy. He will be discussing for us the topic of T-cell therapy with a presentation that is entitled T-cell therapy. And I will now give the microphone to Dr. Cassian Yi. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra, for a kind introduction, Dr. Kalin, for organizing this series. As you know, last time there was a bit of a glitch and we had some technical difficulties and received some documentation from our attendees, some of which were traumatized by the experience. However, we're here now, and these are my disclosures. The topic, as you heard, is T-cell, and I was told to make this enjoyable and interesting, so I went through all the paradigms that I've been using for these types of talks, the first of which was a green eggs and ham paradigm at a time when T-cell therapy was emerging as a potential fourth pillar of immunotherapy, cancer therapy, radiation, and surgery, and certainly wasn't quite so palatable at the time, and perhaps a little more acceptable now with the advent of TIL therapy, CAR, and hopefully ETC therapy as well. Moving on from there, we had developed another paradigm looking closely at the combination of effector cells with the host environment and suggesting that the combination was more potent and long-lasting than either alone, as we had now a number of effector cells to choose from for adoptive therapy in combination with modulators of the host environment. Stepping up our game once again, the Avengers Endgame paradigm is how cancer uses the infinity stones of autoimmunity to undermine the immune system, in that to address this challenge, a team of effective strategies must be employed to meet this challenge. So for this, we have a Mythbusters edition. Sorry for the sound effects. And I would say that many of these myths probably are straw man myths. So basically as a point and counterpoint discussion of what T-cell therapy means and where it's headed, it's important to go back and look at this renaissance immune-based therapy was heralded by the discovery of immune checkpoint blockade, was developed by and discovered by Jim Allison, who you hear about tomorrow. As you know, this intervention leads to significant disease control in patients with refractory disease, many with durable responses, and certainly in combination, a much greater effect that is long-lasting and has affected the lives of literally millions of patients with solid tumor malignancies, as well as liquid tumors. And this seems to be based upon the existence of an endogenous tumor reactive population, especially in patients whose tumor has significant mutational burden as seen in patients with non-small cell lung cancer and melanoma due to inhalation of carcinogens or UV radiation. But the effect of immune checkpoint blockade is also seen in other cancers over the last several years. This has really spawned interest in a number of malignancies and has been a cornerstone of immune-based therapies in cancer therapy in general. However, not all patients will respond to immune checkpoint therapy. Premise here being that it requires an endogenous population of tumor-active T cells and transfers such T cells to patients with a low endogenous frequency is postulated to lead to more effective combined therapy. Hence, the rationale for adoptive cell therapy. And getting back to basics a little bit here, what is it that the T cell sees and how does it see it? It does so by engaging its T cell receptor with a peptide MHC complex on the surface, resulting in deflating noise. But basically, the antigen is processed and presented within the tumor cell, and bits of peptide is then brought to the surface. The cognate T cell receptor engages this peptide MHC complexes, resulting in downstream signaling and release of granzymes, perforin, and cytokines, leading to elimination of the tumor cell. So the question arises, how do you make these T cells and where do you find them? One of the first efforts in this area, and still very effective, is TIL-based therapies, pioneered by Steve Rosenberg at the surgery branch at NCI. By excising out the tumor and teasing out the TIL cells from this tumor by exposure to high-dose IL-2 in vitro, expanding that and giving back to patients who are also given high-dose IL-2 for the reason that these T cells may be dependent on these doses due to its manner of in vitro stimulation. There were actually two advances that brought this into the mainstream and with greater efficacy. One is this rapid expansion protocol, which was actually developed by Phil Greenberg and Stan Liddell in 1990. Mark Dudley from the Rosenberg lab, actually at that time I was junior faculty, was sort of indoctrinated in the strategy, which was then brought back to the NCI and adapted for expansion of these TIL cells. And the second advance is lymphodepletion, something that was foreshadowed by North and colleagues as early as 1982 as being important for providing perhaps homeostatic upregulation of cytokines that would positively influence the transferred lymphocytes in vivo. The regimen that was used was fludarabine and Cytoxan, non-molecular regimen, adapted from the non-molecular stem cell transplant literature at that time, developed by Rick Childs and Rainer Storp. And the combination of these two advances led to a significant increase in efficacy of adoptively transferred TIL cells. The mini myth here is that high-dose IL-2 is required for TIL therapy. When I was at the Hutch, sort of looked at this and tried to obviate the requirement of high-dose IL-2 in vitro by combining these first two strategies as a sort of rep-TIL protocol, using low-dose IL-2 in combination with a T-cell receptor trigger, OKT3, leading to a population of expanded TIL cells that would then administer to the patient with moderate dose lymphodepletion and low-dose IL-2 using a regimen that we had developed as far back as 2002, where a dose of 250,000 units per meter square sub-Q of IL-2 given twice daily was sufficient to saturate the high-affinity IL-2 receptors on T cells in vivo. This dose was about 40 times less than the high-dose IL-2 that was administered. And some lab-based studies demonstrated that the TIL population retained fidelity with the T-cell receptor repertoire that was seen in the extant TIL population prior to expansion, and that the TIL population did contain clones that were different from the peripheral blood T-cell receptor repertoire and possibly were tumor active. Expansion of this rep-TIL led to an enhanced population of CD8 positive T cells, which in subsequent studies has been shown by many others to correlate with the clinical response. And in a very small number of patients, obviously, there was some evidence of efficacy. Even low-dose IL-2 was given. There was evidence of cytokine release in these patients, and fairly robust expansion of these transferred TILs. So obviously, this is a very small study. Other studies have been done using low-dose IL-2 in the original NCI TIL regimen, and many efforts both at the NCI, the Moffitt Cancer Center, Sheba, and Patrick Hu and Chantal Bernatchez at MD Anderson continue to apply the use of TIL therapy to tumors other than metastatic melanoma. So in a way, high-dose IL-2 may not be required, but let's get back to the original myth, which is that tumor-reactive T cells can only be found in the tumor site, and that certainly was a reasonable supposition since that's where the money is. However, I guess about 20 years ago, when I was still young and idealistic, and saw that Mark Davis and John Altman had invented this reagent known as a peptide MHC tetramer to pull out T cells, antigen-specific T cells, based upon their structural properties. Peter Lee and I took a look at the peripheral blood and found that using this as a staining reagent, we were able to identify circulating tumor-reactive T cells in peripheral blood, albeit at very, very low frequency. That didn't deter us from trying to move this into the clinic, and the only method we had at that time was brute force cloning. Literally, we had to screen thousands of clones in order to find the one clone that we then expanded for adoptive transfer. So we would say that that's probably not necessarily true, certainly not at this point. But because it took quite a number of iterations in terms of population doubling to expand a single clone to several billion, it was criticized that such a method would not work. And being on the West Coast, I guess I had ignored that warning. Patrick was a little more conciliatory, but moving forward, one can understand why clones, which have been expanded from one cell to over 10 billion, and if you do the math, undergoes 34 population doublings during this time, may be exhausted. Certainly, if you look at the differentiation of T cells from naive, central effector, and then terminal effector, and effector memory, potentially exhausted cells, one can understand why clones may not work. However, as early as 1995, Ron Pollock postulated that there are actually, in a human T cell lifetime, 50 to 70 population doublings. So even a cell undergoing 34 population doublings needs to undergo only maybe 5 or 6 more doublings to replace the entire lymphocyte population of a human being. So depending on where in this process the cells are isolated, one may or may not have exhausted T cells. And in fact, when we performed this study using clone T cells, we actually were able to demonstrate in some patients a durable complete response. This is a CT scan of a patient with a lesion hanging off the transverse colon here, and 6 weeks later, this lesion is gone. This patient has been tumor-free. This was a metastatic melanoma, treated only with a single infusion of these antigen-specific T cell clones with low-dose IL-2, and no other therapy during this time. If you track these T cells that we gave him in vivo, you can see there's relatively high frequency, up to 1.5 to 5%. This is 508 days out. Even 2 or 3 years later, he continues to have a measurable population of these transfer T cell clones in the peripheral blood. And these T cells seem to recover a central memory phenotype with high CD28 and endogenous production of IL-2. And when we looked at that study, which was published in 2012, the patients that had a complete or partial response demonstrate long-term persistence of the transferred T cells. This is in days at relatively high peripheral frequencies, where those patients who have progressive disease lost recovery of these cells in the peripheral blood. Going in, these T cells look like they're effector memory cells, low CD28 expression, low CD127, or the IL-7 receptor. And in those patients who have progressive disease, this phenotype did not change, whereas in the patients where there was evidence of persistence, the phenotype of these transferred cells measured and extracted ex vivo had a central memory phenotype with high CD28 and high CD127, which brings up the next myth, which is that all T cells are equal, but some are more equal than others. Apologies to George Orwell. And I think going in, these cells look similar, as you can see here. And we identified these cells and extracted them in a sort of stochastic manner, since we had cloned and screened thousands of them. But the question arose, was it possible to isolate central memory type T cells prospectively? Unfortunately, at the time, Fred Hutchinson was next to Zymo Genetics. Zymo Genetics had just cloned IL-21, which was a new gamma chain receptor cytokine. But unlike IL-2, IL-7, and IL-15, also gamma chain receptor cytokines, IL-21 had a unique effect on naive CD8 T cells. So while IL-2, 7, and 15 are considered proliferative cytokines or T cells, IL-21 had a somewhat different role. And more rigorous examination of role of IL-21 during this process demonstrates that exposure to IL-21 during priming of naive T cells leads to enrichment of CD28 positive CD8 T cells, which is a bit unusual in humans. It may not be so uncommon in mice, where most of the CD8 cells are already CD28. But after repeated stimulation, these human antigen-specific T cells lose CD28. When exposed to IL-21 during priming, these IL-21 prime CD28 high cells also retain function. Exposure to B7 engagement leads to production of IL-2 in an antigen-driven manner. Over the last several years, we've looked a little more closely at the epigenetic mechanism in which IL-21 regulates CD28 and discovered that this occurs at a transcriptional level. CD28 expression by RNA analysis is increased in these naive CD8 T cells upon exposure and TCR engagement. This can be abrogated by treatment with shRNA to STAT3, suggesting, in fact, IL-21 mediates CD28 regulation via phospho-STAT3. And the only knockdown humans available are those patients with Job syndrome who have an autosomal dominant mutation in STAT3, which affects their function and phosphorylation. In these patients with Job syndrome, who are STAT3 negative, we see no upregulation of CD28 at either the surface or at the transcriptional level, suggesting, in fact, the IL-21 mediates the effect through phospho-STAT3, and that priming with IL-21 generates essential memory type T cell with upregulation of these markers, polycytokine function, and antigen-driven IL-2 production, giving rise to helper-independent CTL. This was shown in 2005, and then subsequently 2008. And then we treated patients with IL-21 prime versus unprimed T cells recognizing WT1 in the population of high-risk AML patients in Science Translational Medicine in 2013. These cells sit somewhere along the differentiation pathway with these phenotypic markers. And so I would say that this dogma that all T cells are equal, but some are equal than others, is maybe busted. If you look at that path, it appears that T cell differentiation is unidirectional. And certainly as cells are undergo iterative stimulation, you see the phenotypic change as well as chromatin condensation as cells become more differentiated. Those cells which are used for endogenous T cell therapy, in which we isolate them from peripheral blood, you start with a source population in which there is a relatively high fraction of naive T cells. So IL-21 priming does allow one to generate central memory T cells from this population of patients. However, if you look at cells isolated from a TIL, tumor infiltrating population, because of their exposure to tumor antigen, these are more likely to be effector memory cells when pulled out directly from the tumor site. And for CAR T cell therapy, it is a mix of both naive central memory and effector cells that go into culture. So the question really was, does IL-21 also lead to induction of central memory type T cells in the effector population? And it turns out that you do get upregulation of phospho-STAT3 both in naive and effector cells, but you don't see upregulation of CD28. These curves are nearly overlapping when you look at the CD28 phenotype of these cells on the surface in cells that were exposed to IL-21 and not exposed to IL-21, and shown here in a bar chart. So we supposed that phospho-STAT3 does bind to the promoter of CD28, but that effector cells, because the chromatin is condensed, phospho-STAT3 is denied binding. So I guess somewhat obvious strategy to address this challenge would be to pre-treat the patients with an HDAC inhibitor, in this case SAHA. And you see here in this ChIP-seq analysis that a pre-exposure to SAHA leads to binding of phospho-STAT3 in both the proximal and distal promoter regions of CD28, but IL-21 treatment alone does not, when it is not treated with SAHA. And again, shown here in a bar chart, you can see a regulation of CD28, both at the RNA and the flow cytometry analysis, only in those T cells, which those effector T cells, which have been treated with an HDAC inhibitor. Because SAHA is relatively toxic, it does do what you want. We tried a number of other HDAC inhibitors, panobinostat, seem to achieve the same result without a decrease in killing or fold expansion. So we would say that we're able to reprogram these T cells in a way, and it does allow for the induction of central memory T cells and other T cell therapy modalities. This next myth is actually transformative, at least in our research efforts. Single patient trials are already very, I guess, probably vulnerable to a lot of regulatory control, a lot of time and effort put in treating a single patient, but they can, as I say, change the path of research. So just to review briefly, back in 1999, we published with Mark Davis and Peter Lee the ability of peptide MHC tetramers to identify circulating tumor-reactive antigen-specific T cells from the peripheral blood, albeit at a very low frequency. We could sort and then expand these cells to near uniformity. That was in 1999. In 2005, as you saw, IL-21 added during priming of these naive T cells led to a central memory product, which we could also sort and expand. However, to get this into patients would require at least another 5 years. At that time, I received a call from Tony Rebus at UCLA, described a patient, LZ, with metastatic breast cancer who had failed more than 8 lines of therapy, including autologous stem cell transplant, and was asked to meet with LZ and her friend SP at the Stand Up to Cancer telethon. 2 days later, turns out that since we only had the FDA approval to treat patients with melanoma, we were limited in our ability to expand to other cancers, not only because of protocol, but because of the logistical difficulty in isolating and expanding these cells without a tetramer-guided cell sorter. We went ahead anyway and freezed LZ. Turned out her tumor was NY-ESO positive, and there was an epitope presented by HLA-A24, and we decided to proceed with brute force cloning. However, a check arrived a month later to purchase the clinical-grade cell sorter. Cell sorter arrived. We had applied for a single patient CIND to the FDA for the first-in-class use of such a cell sorter, first-in-human use of IL-21 prime T cells, and tetramer-guided cell sorting of antigen-specific T cells for the treatment of cancer. You can imagine we had tried over the last basically 11 years to get this done. If it were not for this patient and generous donor, this could not have been achieved. The sorter finally arrived on January the 4th, but it did not work. And the reason it didn't work was because we couldn't get the spigot to fit in the sheath tank. And Randy Armstrong and Rob Negrin's lab at Stanford was generous enough to allow us to come and observe how he got the sorter to work, isolating Treg cells, and we were able to fit a 99-cent spigot. FDA grants the CIND, and then the next day we were able to perform tetramer-guided cell sorting on a patient with NY-ESO-specific CTL. That's a cell sorter in the GMP facility. This protocol ran through to expansion. We treated the patient with about 5 billion HLA-A2402 restricted NY-ESO peptide-specific T cells. And we saw an in vivo increase in frequency, and in the subsequent dose before her discharge, received another infusion. And then she went back to UCLA, where Tony Rebus and Dr. Glaspie were able to secure, at that time, an anti-CTLA-4 antibody, tremelimumab, because ipilimumab had not been approved at the time. And treatment of this patient with tremi led to more than tripling of the frequency of these endogenously transferred T cells, which were now sitting in the patient's lymphatic system and had, perhaps due to relief of immune suppressive factors, was now able to endogenously increase in frequency to over 3.5%. So because of the, and this was accompanied by a regulation of central memory markers, as we foresaw in the benchtop studies, both CD28, CD127, and even early memory markers of CCR7, consistent with the in vitro studies. Because of this single patient trial, the CIND, we were now able to move from a process that required 12 weeks to one that required 7 weeks. And then further developing this process, we engaged with a company in San Diego to develop the use of a closed MEMS-based system using a tabletop cell sorter, which is based upon really the entire device rests on this little valve that flips back and forth about 50,000 times a second, and allows us to sort cells through a very low shear force, short fluid path into a sorted chamber from which we could then pull out these sorted T cells and then provide a sort of a turnkey operation, since it required really no attendance in terms of looking at the strobe effect of these droplets. This was all a closed system that allowed us then to generate T cells not only against one but several antigens and treat a variety of cancers. This is anticipation of using this device. It is now we're now using a second or third generation device actually in the lab for our studies. So I would say that myth is somewhat controversial, but under the right conditions can lead to significant benefit. These next two hypotheses, that targeting a single antigen is doomed to fail, and that lymphodepletion is required for adoptive cell therapy, maybe more of a straw man type myth, I suppose, but they are interrelated. And if you indulge me for a few minutes here, I'll go through some of the data here to prove or disprove this dogma. Generating the T cells obviously requires a relatively robust process of IL-21 priming, tetramer cell sorting, but that this also requires the ability to modulate the extrinsic environment in which T cells are based. And certainly, as you heard earlier, CTLA-4 seems to play an important role, and so it was natural that the T cells would be combined with the use of CTLA-4 therapy, and found a willing supporter. And for the sake of this trial and the use of vanity plates, we then proceeded with the use of immune checkpoint blockade, in this case CTLA-4, for some of the reasons listed here, that this may enhance the political capacity to transfer T cells, but perhaps more importantly, it may lower the threshold of activation of endogenous tumor-reactive T cells, leading to antigen spreading and potentially multivalent response, depending on your belief. You target Tregs with the CTLA-4 antibody, you may eradicate the modulated function of the Tregs, so an additional added benefit. So this was a study that was performed by my postdoc at the time, Ola Chapuis, who is now an assistant member at Hutchinson, in several studies over the last few years. These were published, treating patients with metastatic melanoma who are HLA-A2 positive, and targeting a differentiation antigen. Now, MART1 is not really the best antigen to target, although it's readily accessible and it's broadly expressed in melanoma patients. It is a differentiation antigen, so it can be lost without impunity to the survival or oncogenesis of the tumor cell. And it's not always uniformly expressed intratumorally. Nevertheless, we proceeded with a study in this protocol where patients received low-dose IL-2 prior to infusion of 10 billion central memory type T cells per meter squared, a fairly uniform specificity and phenotype, followed by a single course of ipilimumab every 3 weeks, 4 doses, and patient received nothing else following this. These first 10 patients, usually the first 10 patients are the best responders, and was in this case as well. These first 10 patients had fairly good response in 2, a durable complete response, 2 significant partial responses, and 2 follow immune-related response criteria. 2 of these had disease control. This was not small volume disease. Some of these are rather bulky disease. This is a patient who had failed prior ipilimumab. Several months later, recurrence of disease in the peritracheal parabronchial tree, and this led to complete eradication of the tumor following a single infusion of T cells plus 1 course of ipilimumab. As you can see, this time course to the best overall response it took many, many months, in some cases almost a year and a half. But during this time, the tumor was decreasing in size at every point during evaluation, and no other intervening therapy was given. If you track these T cells as a log scale, they persist a long term at frequencies of 0.5 to 8%. If you follow central memory markers of these tumor stained T cells in vivo, you see that even though some of them come in as effector phenotype, they do regulate the central memory markers over time. This was not seen in the patients whose disease progressed. This is an example of antigen spreading, where elimination of a tumor may lead to cross-presentation of other non-targeted tumor-associated antigens and induction of a multivalent response. So over on the Z scale here is time from 0 days to 189 days. So over a period of 6 months, this patient initially received a single infusion of MART1 specific T cells without CTLA4 therapy, and you see an increase here by ELISpot analysis of the frequency of these MART1 specific cells in peripheral blood. During this interval, the patient received salvage therapy with ipilimumab. New lung lesions appeared, and then about 3 or 4 months after the discontinuation of ipilimumab, actually 6 months after discontinuation of ipilimumab, when the disease continued to progress, this patient was treated with a single infusion of IL-21 prime T cells plus CTLA4, and we see a significant and robust increase in MART1 specific response. That, though, we also saw responses to several non-targeted antigens over this period of time, some to levels as higher than that of the infused T cells. And in a 2D rendition, this is what it looks like. Initial infusion, nothing significant in terms of responses or response to other non-targeted antigens shown here with different colors, the height of which represents the magnitude of response, but following CTLA4 therapy plus T cell infusion, there is an increase in responses to the other non-targeted antigens. Seen that with all progressors. 4 of these patients had prior checkpoint therapy, including this patient. This patient actually had high dose steroids due to colitis from the CTLA4 blockade. Although you see a decrease in the functional response, the T cells did persist, and he did experience actually a complete response. And spreading was not seen in non-responders. The conclusion from this study, I guess in refutation of those two myths, is that under the right conditions, antigen spreading may be induced to preclude the outgrowth of antigen loss variants. This is demonstrated in the study recently published, and also actually in the earlier New England Journal study showing the adoptive transfer of an MOE, so specific CD4 T cell led to antigen spreading and a complete response in a patient with melanoma. We assume that recruitment of additional antigen-specific T cells may be required for a complete and durable response. And perhaps more importantly, lymphodepletion, while may be required to mitigate rejection of transgene expressing T cells, for example, for CAR T cell therapy, they're not required for endogenous T cells or non-engineered T cells, at least not in the setting of preventing rejection of a transgene. Thus allows for the induction of antigen spreading where you have not eliminated the endogenous population, potentially tumor-reactive cells. So we've always moved towards a more gentler lymphodepletion regimen. That's not to say that lymphodepletion doesn't lead to expansion or peak expansion of transfer T cells. However, in this case, we did see evidence of a complete response, many of which were durable once a complete response was achieved. And so related to the theory of antigen spreading, lymphodepletion may not be required for adoptive therapy and may be counterproductive. Finally, one of the, I guess, assumptions that even I had made was that the reason why there were circulating antigen-specific T cells in peripheral blood is because they were in vivo immunized by the presence of tumor antigen products, and the extension of that premise is that T cells are therefore elicited preferentially from antigen-experienced pools since they're present at higher frequency. However, when we did a T cell receptor repertoire analysis of the T cell products and tracked them in vivo after adoptive transfer, let's take the example here of patient 1, where clonal type analysis reveals that 10 different clones comprise more than 98% of the entire T cell product. This is seen similarly across all the other patients, maybe as high as 700 or so different clones, but in most cases, a relatively small number of clone types comprised the majority of the T cell product, which was uniformly targeted against a specific epitope. Um, and if you go back and take a look at the peripheral blood of these patients prior to adoptive transfer, it turns out that these T cell receptor clone types cannot be found in the peripheral blood of these patients. And given that the sensitivity of detection by PCR is less than 1 in 100,000, probably 1 in a million, it's likely that these T cells came from a very low frequency T cell pool, possibly a naive T cell pool or earlier. Um, and what we had expected to see, which was um, a population of T cells isolated from antigen experience pool, represented here by the orange slice of the pie, was not a significant fraction of the T cell product, nor did it persist after adoptive transfer. So you can see here these T cell receptor clone types represented by the blue section of the pie and by this blue line here completely overlap the frequency of the cells detected in peripheral blood is determined by tetramer staining. And that the antigen experienced population really, although measurable, was present in relatively low frequency. Remember, this is log scale. Perhaps it's not surprising because induction of central memory T cells is preferentially expanded from a naive T cell pool. So at least in our studies with the protocol that we used, these T cell clones came from a very low frequency pool, and that the half-life of these T cell receptor clones, which you can now measure by tracking them over time, appear to correlate with the clinical response. This can be seen here. So this is actually somewhat promising in the way that, for two reasons. One is that patients obviously don't need to be immunized in order to isolate relatively robust, highly proliferative T cells. But secondly, also means that it was now possible to isolate T cells that were present very low frequency, perhaps against shared or normal tumor-associated antigens. And so the last myth that I want to deal with here is that the only good antigens are neoantigens. And certainly neoantigens have a number of advantages. They're highly tumor selective, obviously, as they're usually the product of splice variants or mutations, and has been seen in some studies. T cells directed against neoantigens can reject tumor. However, by and large, these are not, at least in many of our studies and others, the preponderance of tumor-associated responses. And so one of the challenges moving beyond melanoma was to identify other immunogenic tumor-associated peptides and epitopes that could induce an antigen-specific T cell response against tumors other than melanoma, which I guess we had considered more of a gateway cancer immune-based therapies. We're now faced with the challenge of identifying other potentially immunogenic peptides. And I guess important sort of to state up front what is considered immunogenic peptide. And this is a definition which I've held, and hopefully others as well. That immunogenic peptide is one that is processed from the desired antigen, it's presented by the MHC on the surface with sufficient density as to elicit a T cell response with sufficient affinity to recognize tumor cells endogenously presenting such peptide. And so just to emphasize the important points of this statement here, this is really from nuts to bolts. So it's actually empiric generation of T cells, not merely the in silico prediction. No matter how good the AI algorithms are, only a relatively small fraction of predicted neoantigens are in fact fulfill this criteria. So people in my lab and Greg Lizet, we started looking at different antigen epitopes, but a more direct fashion using a tandem mass spectrometry, a method that was pioneered by Andrea Gramsci many years ago. And we look at these spectra, or these array of eluded tumor antigens, and then filtered them only after we identified them against potential predicted tumor epitopes. So it does require a process of sample preparation using a requisite number of tumor cells, elution of peptide from the MHC, sample population by liquid chromatography, then tandem mass spectrometry. And I won't go into details of this, except to say that this was quite a tour de force of effort performed by Yulin and Kay to run at least 40 runs in which 428,000 spectra were generated. And through prioritization and filtration of some of these against TCGA and GTEx database arrived at 278 epitopes, which are more uniquely expressed in tumor than they were in normal tissues. And I'll show you what actually that heat map is of that one line that's present right here in the GTEx database. So this workflow, which was confirmed using synthetic acetate labeled peptide in many cases, provided a large panel of, we believe, immunogenic 278 epitopes for 137 antigens, of which by prioritization, at least 70 of them were cancer testis-like antigens. So as you can see, well, if you squint your eyes a bit here, a given epitope is expressed across a spectrum of different solid and liquid tumors, and is only expressed in this particular column of tissues, which represents testis tissue. So these are considered tumor selective, and they're also broadly shared. What do we have here? I'm sorry, I had to redact some of this, but basically by prioritizing at least 10 of these antigens, some of which are broadly expressed across the tumor TCGA database, some which we selected for other reasons, for example, these prostate cancer associated tumor antigens. And again, if you squint your eyes even harder, you can see that some of these same epitopes are representing different alleles and different restrictions, and that the majority of these tumor-associated epitopes and antigens are only expressed in the testis. Now, here's an example of one of these tumor antigens that we directed to looking at the CT antigen by Angelique Whitehurst at UT Southwestern, who pointed out some interesting facts about HORMAD1, its association with tumor mutational burden, rate of resistance and resistance in providing a tumor selective advantage in terms of the resistant oxidative and genotoxic stress. It was also highly expressed in certain types of lung cancer, and you can see by the GTEx database it's selectively expressed in the testis, and that is broadly expressed across a number of different tumors here, a prevalence of greater than 50%, a transcript per megabase of greater than 4 and as high as 10. This is the same chart in greater detail for esophageal cancer, lung cancer, head and neck cancer, cervical cancer, bladder cancer, and even AML. And we take a look at this, for example, some work that was done and summarized here. We were able to use the A2 restricted epitope that Yulin and Kay identified using tandem mass spec to generate antigen-specific T cells, clone them out, and evaluate their tumor activity. This A12 clone, as can be seen here, shows relatively high affinity against the peptide dose titration curve and significant activity against endogenous presenting tumor targets. B6 clone, perhaps not as robust. And so selecting from the different clones, we were able to pull out the alpha and beta chain, express it in a retroviral vector, and then infect a population of lymphocytes, which we then sorted and expanded to near uniformity, demonstrating further that this T cell receptor alpha beta chain from the A12 clone had significantly elevated affinity for its target. This is, if you look at the scale here, this is actually 10 picograms per mil in terms of its peptide concentration necessary to elicit T cell killing, and that its recognition and killing of a lung cancer target, endogenous presenting the epitope and HL allele, is relatively high. This is over 70% at E2 ratio of 2.5 to 1. Typically, 20 and 40 to 1 are used, but we had to go way down here in order to demonstrate the dropping off. If you compare TCR-T therapy to ETC, even though there's a non-putative T cell receptor may be overexpressed, but it does not increase, at least in this case, killing against a negative target, a negative control. It has substantially increased killing, even at low to E to T ratios against the endogenous target. And just to overlay this in the same scale, it's significantly higher than that with ETC, although ETC is still shows significant activity. This was an A2 restricted epitope. Certainly, the A2 allele is frequently expressed in the Caucasian Asian population. And since HORMAD1 was also expressed with high prevalence in patients with gastric cancer, gastric cancer is one of the #1 killers in Southeast Asia. We also looked at one of the alleles that were expressed predominantly in the Asian population, A11, was also able to identify a peptide epitope and induce T cells against hormone-positive tumor cells. Looking at the other prioritized tumor-associated antigens here, we're interested in some cases against T cells that recognize prostate cancer. Um, and additionally, this antigen identification allowed us to target both rare and common tumors, glioblastoma, prostate cancer, cardiac angiosarcoma, and gallbladder cancer. Um, One of these epitopes, for example, one of these antigens, not only is a potential target for cholangiocarcinoma, for example, but is also broadly expressed in a wide variety of tumor-associated targets here, both solid and liquid tumors. Just to give you a little bit of detail, the green bar represents prevalence for a given tumor. In this case, for example, breast cancer at greater than 4 transcripts per megabase, and the blue chart shows the prevalence at greater than 10 transcripts per megabase, and we consider 4 the cutoff for antigen recognition. So I guess this myth is probably, busted in a way, pretty easy to bust actually. But now we actually have a large panel of tumor-associated antigens. And so it looks like over the last 20 years, I spent my time taking care of some of these myths, and there's certainly many more challenges to be addressed, not the least of which is that there are a number of immunomodulators to consider and immune-based modalities to be used in combination with effector cells. And one way to approach this problem is to consider these relatively uniform population of antigen-specific T cells as a transferable cellular biomarker that has certain intrinsic properties that are desirable, long-term proliferation, and that when these adoptive transfer into a patient, one can now apply some of these extrinsic reagents or modulators and evaluate them in a more rigorous fashion. In this case, either various lymphodepletion regimens or various agonists or checkpoint antagonists, or in this case, even a vaccine. And we've embarked on some of those studies, looking more closely at this uniform population of cells subject to immunomodulation and extracting analyzed in vivo. And these studies are underway in ovarian cancer, sarcoma, uveal melanoma, with the cooperation of several clinical investigators, Dr. Diab, Dr. Patel, Dr. Samaya, and Dr. Jaziri. These are the people who did all the work. I'm going to point out Kay here and Yulin, who did a lot of the antigen discovery work. Ivy, who really has led the team, has been actually my lab for the last 10 years, performing the cell therapy clinical trials with the support of Macrina, Rebecca, and Laura Sheo, who leads the research component of the lab. Janae and Chelsea performing many of the regulatory and clinical trial necessary components in order to get the trial going. Jinmei, who recently published in Cancer Immunology Research her very long and detailed findings of IL-21 epigenetics, and graduate students Farah Hassan and Yating, who are working on some more basic research looking at T cell biology and T cell function. I do have to thank a number of collaborators here who I've published with, and certainly a number of ongoing collaborations, which we have not published. I'm very grateful for. Finally, I guess I'm just going to close. The path to success for all those out there has not been easy, but it is important to remain agile, avoid pitfalls, and pathfully make it to a safe haven. Yeah, he's still running there. There we go. All good. Anyway, thank you very much. I hope you got something out of this, and it was enjoyable for me as it was for you. Let me just end go here so I can take some questions. Oh, sorry.
So thank you, Dr. Yi. This was a truly excellent review that has been extremely interesting and giving a lot of hope for the future. There is a question that came from the participants, and the question is, where can you find tumor reactive T cells in hematological cancer such as leukemia? You find
Yeah, that's a good question actually, because you can actually goes straight to the marrow. And in fact, Dr. Borrelia, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing his name, um, actually has been doing MIL studies, actually marrow infiltrating lymphocyte studies, um, and potentially identifying antigen-specific tumor-reactive T cells from the bone marrow and using that for adoptive cell therapy. More along the lines of endogenous T cell therapy, I think the point I was trying to make is, in fact, that the peripheral blood obviously is one relatively rich source of antigen-specific T cells. And I know that chart I showed you with all the potential tumor-associated antigen targets was too small to read completely, but there are a number of targets there that are presented by leukemia cells and lymphoma cells. And so a lot of tumor-associated antigens will be present on both leukemia cells and solid tumors, surprisingly, and a lot of cancer testis antigens are present. And we have been able to isolate them from the peripheral blood because of the reasons I mentioned that this method is robust enough to isolate relatively rare cells that probably come from a naive T cell pool. So we're actually working with Dr. Klonpleva and Dr. Saxena in her lab, as well as people in the lymphoma team, to generate T cells against some of those liquid tumor targets.
Thank you. And I would like to remind the audience to utilize the chat function to ask questions you may have. While we wait for other questions, I have a question for you. So you have been breaking down several myths. Do you have one myth that you think still holds true about T
Wait,
cell therapy?
is there one myth that still holds true?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I have to apologize. Obviously, that's for maybe entertainment purposes. Not all the myths I think everyone believes completely. So, certainly, let me say, I guess I phrased it in a way to make it easier to bust. But uh, tumor reactive T cells certainly can be found in high frequency in the tumor site. Um, uh, but they're not the only source. I suppose that myth certainly continues to hold true. Obviously, the basis for TIL-based therapies, which have enjoyed a sort of renaissance in itself in the last few years. Um, yes, you know, just more broadly, I wouldn't obviously discouraging targeting multiple antigens. So um, there's certainly value in that, and we're pursuing that. I think a lot of it was mostly logistical, but pursuing antigens that belong to different classes, whether they're a differentiation antigen or CT antigen, or antigens associated with radio resistance or some other type of targeted or chemo resistance, certainly has significant advantages. And targeting multiple antigens is something I would strongly advocate. It was more along the lines of that a single antigen may still give rise to multivalent response under the right conditions, but targeting multi-antigen certainly gives you an immediate advantage.
And I have another question that has to do of the time that the T cell persist and are active. What do you consider will be an optimal time of persistence, and how can you modify it to make it optimal for the cancer type you're treating?
Yeah, that's a $1 billion question. So um, I think that the um, the persistence, and first of all, just to keep in mind that the cells, the persistence that we track was only in the peripheral blood, so it doesn't actually tell us what's going on in the tumor. So obviously, it's much more important to see what's going on at the tumor site. And I think that studies borne out by Pam Sharma and Jim Allison and the immunotherapy team have certainly shown that that's important for immune checkpoint therapies, and I believe that's also important um, for adoptive cell therapy, of course. And there is a correlation with persistence and response, not only in ETC, but also CAR T cell therapy. So I would say that I think that it's kind of very difficult to set a cutoff. Certainly, we would like to see persistence beyond 1 or 2 months, um, but it depends how you measure it. And I think that there will hopefully always be a population of memory cells that remain present either in the lymph node or some other sites. so that they can provide immunoprotection following recurrence. I guess what I'm trying to say in a way is that we don't really have an answer to that. We do need to measure this more precisely. I think that certainly the short-term persistence we saw early on, lasting only 1 to 2 weeks, and for some cell therapies, which don't enrich for memory population, have only experienced measurable persistence at very low frequency for a very short period of time, does not translate into efficacy. Um, I don't think that the magnitude of the response as measured in peripheral blood is necessarily um, a correlation with clinical response. You can have very high maximum frequency, but the persistent frequency may not need to be very high as those T cells may be present in tissues that are not measurable in the peripheral blood.
Perfect. Yeah.
Cassian, this is George. Wonderful presentation. Thank you. Thank you for everything. So I have a question. So what is the stage of the studies on characterizing the biomarkers of a patient who will respond or not in addition to these neoantigens? Because there should be many more components in this T cell tumor and patient body interaction. There are studies checking for these characteristics of T cells, characteristic of germline in the patients and so on.
Yeah, well, I guess that's one of the questions we're hoping to address with you, George. But I think that there's already a lot of literature out there, trying to identify cells that have low exhaustion markers or high stem cell-like markers, TCF, for example, versus TOX. But I think that even some of the mechanisms, whether you drive the appropriate STAT3 signal, and alter the circuitry of these cells can be important. I think really maybe some of this all dovetails into T cell metabolism and those factors that affect the energetics of the T cell in terms of its ability to either resist hypoxemia, resist ROS, but also to utilize the nutrients that are available in that tumor microenvironment. So the question of persistence not only lies in, whether you have a stem cell-like T cell or a T cell hyperlymph capacity, but how it accommodates itself in the tumor microenvironment. So I think there are many clues in terms of, which direction to go to. But I think you do need to start with a cell with some prolific capacity before you try and impose additional engineering or metabolic cues to enhance T cell function. It's still a large unknown.
So we have two more questions from the audience. The first one is, do central memory T cells have increased ability to infiltrate the tumor parenchyma compared to other subtypes?
Yeah, so good question. Actually not. So it's important, or actually it's unknown, I guess, to put it simply. I mean, if your central memory T cell, expresses even an earlier memory marker, such as CD62L or CCR7, they're actually less likely to infiltrate the tumor environment. They may be induced after antigen activation to differentiate and lose those markers, which allow them to home to lymph nodes and other tissues. But the problem of getting T cells into the tumor, we haven't been able to examine closely enough, obviously, because we haven't looked at the tumor site in all cases. But that's another question. That's another challenge, and that obviously involves methods to induce chemokine production at the tumor site. Obviously, make the tumor more hot and so on. There are some studies showing that that radiation or obviously T cell migration to tumor sites, but that is a significant challenge. More so for some tumors than others. For example, pancreatic cancer certainly appears to have active biochemical as well as physical barriers to T cell infiltration, and that certainly is one of the combination approaches that needs to be addressed.
And I think this really ties well in with the next question, that is, do you think that there could be increased utility in the future for low immunotherapy responding types of cancer, including breast cancer?
Yes. So I think that is one of the hopes. And the first step towards that obviously is identifying targets. If you believe that antigen-specific therapy is going to be effective, we think we have a number of targets, other people as well. But that these targets are not just surface targets for CAR T cell therapy, which is important, of course, but also a whole number of other targets that are presented and recognized by T cells, which are intracellular targets, allowing for a much broader array of tumor-associated antigens in immunogenicity to develop. And I think that treating cancers, for example, triple-negative breast cancer, glioblastoma, others with a huge unmet need, actually are important stepping stone to treating more common cancers. For example, those cancers for which there's little response to immune checkpoint therapy, perhaps because there's a low endogenous tumor-active T cell population, may benefit from a synergistic combinations with immune checkpoint therapy or immune agonists.
Great, thank you. And I think we have completed our time. I would like again to thank you, Dr. Yi, and all the participants for this really wonderful section. I'm really glad everything went smoothly. I would like therefore to thank you also Alison Gart and Elizabeth Kent for their technical assistance. And I want to remind everyone to stay tuned for tomorrow's session where Dr. Jim Allison will be presenting. And again, thank you for listening and watching, and please be safe, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
And thank you from my side. Thank you again.
Shout out to Alice and Elizabeth. Thank you, guys. Thank you all.